Is one of our nation's favorite TV paint instructors a serial killer? Follow me down the rabbit hole about Bob Ross. Hello, friends, and welcome back to the rabbit hole. I'm your host, Danny, and today we are talking about Bob Ross. Yep, you heard me right. When I first told my husband this, he was like, seriously? Bob Ross? Everyone loves Bob Ross. And I agree, everyone loves Bob Ross. That's why it's so hard to fathom that maybe he wasn't who he said he was. That's why this one's so much fun. So thank you, Robert, for the suggestion. I really appreciate it. So let's get into it. So Ross was an intensely private person. So the history on him is not incredibly detailed, but like this is what I know. And I'll share with you everything I found. Anyway, he was born Robert Norman Ross on October 29th, 1942 in Daytona Beach, Florida. And he was born to Jack and Ollie Ross, and he had a half brother, Jim. He mentioned Jim a couple times in his show, and eventually we'll get into some more of the history of like he handed over like his will, all of his things to Jim when his son was really young. We're not obviously not there yet, but Jim plays a role in his life. However, when Bob was about a year and a half old, his parents divorced. So then and I don't know which parent he moved with, but he moved to Orlando and he was raised in Orlando, and he spent most of his youth caring for injured animals like armadillos, snakes, alligators, squirrels, which sounds like very Florida of him, you know? If you're from Florida, I'm sure you can appreciate that. Like this dude, I would never in a million years care for a snake. I think I would lose my mind. But he loved the animals, so also, later in his life, gray squirrels and like birds, different things appeared on his show, like live animals, and also he would paint them into his paintings. He dropped out of high school his freshman year. So I think from what I'm understanding, he finished his freshman year and then dropped out of school. And that's when he started working with his father. His father was a carpenter, so he became a carpenter with his dad. But while he did that, he lost the like part of his first finger on his left hand, and he tried to hide that a lot in his show, but like I think he was a little embarrassed about it, but he did lose part of his finger. In 1961, at the age of 18, Ross enlisted in the U.S. Air Force. His job was a medical records technician, and Ross was a career man, which I knew he was in the Air Force, but I didn't know he did a full 20 years. So yeah, he did 20 years. He retired as a master sergeant, or like E7 for those of us that don't understand Air Force lingo. It sounds funny because I was in the Navy. I have no idea all the ranks in the Air Force. So he was stationed in Alaska during the early 60s. I think maybe during a decent amount of time in his Air Force career, he was in Alaska. And this is really important because this is where he first saw snow, and he also first saw mountains. Because being from Florida, you're not going to be familiar with those things. Also, while he was in Alaska, Ross became interested in painting. I think this was his first stint in Alaska because he went to a painting class that the USO put on, and he was like pretty into it. I think he was into painting before, which is why he went to the class, but he would often get frustrated at the painting instructors because, quote, they'd tell you what makes a tree, but they wouldn't tell you how to make a tree, end quote. So, he wasn't like super into them, and that's when he kind of went to other places to look for instruction. So he found a show that he quite liked on PBS about painting that helped him grow and learn. This show was called The Magic of Oil Painting, and the instructor was Bill Alexander. So key things about Bill Alexander. First things first, he was German, so he had a pretty heavy German accent. Second thing is he was pretty aggressive on the air, which again, it sounds very German of him. So later on, when Bob Ross got his own show, he always talked like really like smooth and like kind of tried to soothe you, almost like he was flirting with you a little bit. And that's because he wanted to be the opposite of Bill Alexander, but not really like the opposite. I don't know. Bill Alexander later on would be like oh, he's not my prodigy or whatever. You know, he doesn't really like that he felt like Bob stole his thing. I don't know. There was a little tension there in the end. But Bob Ross wanted to make you feel like anybody could paint. And that was like his biggest thing, is that he was going to show anybody that they could paint. But it was Bill Alexander's show that taught him the technique that would make his career. So Bill Alexander's show taught him the wet on wet oil painting technique, which basically says that you don't have to wait for your oil paint to dry. You can just put more paint on top. And Bill Alexander's show aired from 1974 to 1982. Throughout Bob's military career, he continued to paint, and then he would even start to sell his paintings to local tourists. And eventually, he would start to earn more money selling his paintings than his military salary was, which honestly, like, is not saying a lot. You don't get paid a whole lot to be in the military, but that's still pretty good that he replaced his income basically with his paintings. So while he was in, he did earn the nickname Bust 'em Up Bobby because he was kind of a bit of a ball buster, really. But he didn't like to be tough and mean. So, as like the military requires you to be, right? So he decided that when he got out, he wasn't going to yell or raise his voice anymore. And especially while he was still in, like, that was the time when you were getting yelled at all the time. You were constantly like uniform checks, all these different things, where now it's like a kinder, gentler military where they don't do as much yelling. They don't do as much, like, I don't know, making you do push-ups. Maybe in other branches they do. In the Navy, they don't make you do push-ups if you like messed up, where they used to. So things to think about. Back then, it was a little more rough. But he did get out of the Air Force in 1981. However, so he had some marriages mixed in there. So I just went ahead and put these after because I didn't know how to scatter them throughout. So 1965, he married Vivian Ridge. Just a year after they got married, they had their son Steve. It seems that Steve was the second of Bob's children. So he had fathered a child while he was a teenager, but there's little to no information about that child, and it doesn't seem like Bob was really involved in his life at all. Bob and Vivian got divorced in 1977, allegedly due to infidelity. Then he married Jane Ross in 1977. So the same year he got divorced, he got remarried. In all the research I did, he did not have any children with Jane. And Jane died in 1992 from cancer. And that really tore Bob apart. That really kind of hit him hard. Just 2 months before his death, he married a third time to Linda Brown. This, from the documentary on Netflix, this kind of seemed more of like a way to stop the Kowalskis from stealing everything of Bob's, but it did not work. And I bet you're wondering, who are the Kowalskis? Don't you worry, because we're going to get into those guys, and they are not nice people. I guess they ended up not being nice people. To begin with, they were kind of nice, maybe. But before Bob met Annette Kowalski, he got out of the Air Force, and he went back to Florida, and he sought out private lessons with Bill Alexander. He also joined Alexander's art supplies company and became a traveling salesman and tutor. That's where he met Annette Kowalski, because she attended one of Ross's sessions in Clearwater, Florida, and she claims that she was mesmerized by Ross's personality, and she said that she could not paint the whole class because she just watched him and how he instructed the class. She is the one that convinced Ross that he could be successful on his own, that he did not need to work for Bill, and he could basically do everything that Bill's doing, but Bob Ross style. So Ross and his wife at the time, who was Jane, and Annette Kowalski and her husband Walt all went into business together. Fun fact, Walt Kowalski, when they went into business together, he had just gotten out of the CIA. Their first year of business was really rough, though. They lost about $20,000. So not looking good if you're trying to run a business, that's for sure. And in fact, this is why Ross permed his hair and created his like iconic look. So he thought that if his hair was permed, then he wouldn't have to get it cut once a week, which I think he was doing as like an after effect of his military career. A lot of people do this where they get out and they like keep their hair the exact same. They keep cutting it how they should. You have a lot of people like do the complete opposite and don't do it at all. So it goes one of two ways, right? So Ross was like, if I perm my hair, then I can save money. In his later years, he would grow to dislike his hair, but it was such a part of his brand at that point that he couldn't really change it. They basically, I mean, everything you think about Bob Ross, he's got that perm. In 1982, a station in Virginia aired a taping of Ross's art class as a pilot, and 60 PBS stations signed up for the show in the first year. Exactly how he got the attention to be on TV is kind of unclear. There are two different versions of the story, and they both could be true. So the first one says that he filmed a commercial for the network with Bill Alexander, and he basically caught the eye of the right person. And they were like, wow, that guy is really cool. The other story says that Kowalski filmed one of Ross's 30-minute lessons and sent it to the network, who liked it enough to greenlight a pilot. But I don't know. I think both things could be true. He could have been in the commercial and then like gotten seen by the right person. And then when Kowalski sent in his video, they were like, oh yeah, that's the guy from the commercial. So I don't see why both of them can't be true. In 1983, the PBS station in Indiana convinced him to move there with the promise of creative freedom. So he did. He picked up and he moved. He also found kinship with the staff, so that was really nice. In the documentary, the Netflix documentary, the director was interviewed, and it just seemed like everybody really liked him. He was a really nice guy. Later, in 1989, Ross would move his family back to Florida, and then he would just go back to Indiana to like every 3 months or so to film the show. So The Joy of Painting ran from January 1983 to May of 1994. And during this time, Ross said that he did the show for free and only made money off selling like how-to books, videotapes, art supplies, blah, blah, blah. All of this he was selling with the help of the Kowalskis through Bob Ross Incorporated. And they made this business into a $15 million business. The Kowalskis, it seems like they were decent business people. They also loved stealing ideas. So they basically stole all of Bill Alexander's ideas and put it onto Bob Ross. They kind of used him as like a front man and ran this whole business off the fruits of his labor. So, of course, like I said earlier, during his time on air, Ross was known for his wet-on-wet technique, which allowed him and all those that he was teaching to paint pretty quickly because he did all of his paintings in 28 minutes. And he only used a 1-inch brush, a 2-inch brush, and painting knives. But this also meant that he had to use a lot of paint thinner to get the paint off his brushes because oil paintings. So he had to get the paint off his brushes somehow. So he was constantly sniffing oil thinner or paint thinner fumes, which would bite him in the butt later when it killed him. But we're not there yet. So Ross is known for his phrases such as, quote, let's add some happy little trees, and there are no mistakes, just happy accidents, and ever make mistakes in life, let's just make them birds. Yeah, they're birds now. So just a couple because we all love Bob Ross. Maybe you won't after this episode. I don't know. So, although people think Joy of Painting wasn't rehearsed at all, that wasn't 100% true. So, for every single show, every single episode, Bob Ross created 3 paintings. The first one he did before the show aired, and he would use, like, that would be kept off stage where he could see it as, like, a reference point to what he was doing during the show, and he labeled it Kowalski. The second one he did while he was filming, and that one was labeled TV. The last one he did, he would paint in more detail, and that one would be labeled book because later on they would include a photo of that picture, the most detailed picture, in his how-to book. Which, honestly, I never found out why he labeled the first one Kowalski, but I've got more questions about that. If you want to watch The Joy of Painting, it's on Hulu, so you can go watch it. I've thought about watching it in, like, trying to see if I can paint. Bob Ross says anybody can paint. Let me tell you, I can paint by number. That's about it. On July 4th, 1995, Bob Ross died at the age of 52. So he had smoked most of his adult life, and he had several health issues just throughout his life. But he died due to complications from lymphoma. It definitely seems like this was a side effect of him doing these oil paintings for so many years, and like I said, sniffing paint thinner. I mean, he wasn't like physically sniffing it, but he was just around it so much, and it's a pretty strong smell if you've ever smelled it. It's very aggressive, so definitely seems like that might have been what caused it. They alluded to that in the documentary as well. And in this documentary on Netflix called Bob Ross, Happy Accidents, Betrayal, and Greed, they interview Steve Ross, who is Bob Ross's son. And actually, Steve went around with Bob for a long time. He was featured on the show a couple times. He taught Bob Ross painting classes along with another man who's interviewed heavily in that documentary as well. It's actually a pretty good little documentary. Does not go over the conspiracy I'm about to share with you, but does go over a lot about how the Kowalskis kind of screwed Bob Ross and his whole family over. Speaking of, so under the terms of the incorporation of Bob Ross, in the event of a death of any partner, the person's stock would be equally divided among the others. So when Jane died back in 1992, her stocks got divided between the three of them. But that basically meant that it was the Kowalskis against Bob. So Bob literally could not outvote them, because now it wasn't 2-on-2. It was 3-on-1 or 2-on-1. So anything Bob wanted, he couldn't really get. The Kowalskis basically ran the show at that point. When Bob died, all of his shares went to the Kowalskis. However, he tried to protect himself. Like I stated earlier, he tried to protect himself when his son was still really young. He had signed a will of some sort to kind of make his brother Jim in charge of his shares, his stuff, when he died. Well, the Kowalskis tried very, very aggressively to get Ross to sign over his name on his deathbed. So he's actively dying, and they're like, hey, and they tried to convince Steve to have him sign it. They tried to convince anybody that would talk to him, sign over his name to the Kowalskis. He didn't want to do that. He wouldn't do it. But after his death, his brother Jim, the Kowalskis got to him. I don't know what they offered him, but he signed over Bob Ross's name. So to this day, the Kowalski family, and now it's run by their daughter, but the Kowalski family owns everything about Bob Ross. So anything you buy that's like a Bob Ross memorabilia, that money is going to the Kowalskis, not the Ross family. Anyway, for the real reason you're here, let's get into the conspiracy theories. There's a couple I have here for you. First things first, was Bob Ross a serial killer? So we know that Ross painted landscapes. That's what he did. He did landscapes. And they didn't really have a significant meaning. But what if they did? Like, you're telling me he just like randomly came up with this landscape in his head and he painted it? That seems far-fetched. I don't know. I'm not an artist. Maybe. The theory is that Ross has a photographic memory, and he isn't just painting any old landscape like that he just came up with. He is actually painting a place. More specifically, a place where he hid bodies of his victims. To continue this theory, wherever he writes his name is where the body is buried. And in fact, there is a place, in a park or something, where it looks very, very similar to one of Bob Ross's paintings, and 5 bodies were found in this park, in this part of nature. They were half eaten and buried. Like, what? The thing is, so Bob Ross has this gentleness, like Mr. Rogers, right? Like, not very many men are like this, where they have this like gentleness, this easiness about them. Is it because he's getting his anger out somewhere else? Like, how can you go from being bust 'em up Bobby to Bob Ross PBS painter in the flip of a switch? Like, that just seems strange to me. Especially like you did 20 years in the military. You're just gonna walk out and just like it just all leaves your body. I still say Roger that to a lot of things. I still use Navy terms all the time. I've been out for years. It's hard for me to believe that he got out and he was like, I'm never going to be mean to anybody ever again. And he just never was. Bob Ross said he was so happy because he can make the world he is painting as happy as he wants. Well, is it happy because there's dead bodies in those paintings? But you can paint it you can make it as perfect as you want to in your painting so nobody would know there's ever a dead body? But another thing is that you can't hardly find any of the over 30,000 paintings Ross did throughout his career. It's estimated about 30,000 because he did 3 of each painting, right? Where are all those paintings at? I mean, you can see them in his instructional books, but like a Bob Ross original is really hard to come by. Joan Kowalski, so the daughter of Annette and Walt, has all of the paintings just tucked away. But they're not like stored properly or anything. They're just like in a room somewhere. But here's the deal. The Kowalskis are so hell-bent on just making as much money off of Bob Ross as humanly possible. Why would they not sell those? They could sell them for a pretty penny, I bet, each one. Or they could like put them up in a Bob Ross museum and they could charge money. And they say, Joan Kowalski says, well, Bob just never wanted to make any money off of his paintings. Oh, bite me. You want to make money off his paintings. It doesn't matter what Bob Ross wanted. Your parents didn't respect what he wanted. Now all of a sudden you're going to respect his wishes? Forget that. Like, come on. You're selling a waffle maker with his face on it. You're selling Chia Pets that have Bob Ross. Like, Bob Ross is everywhere, and you're just making money off of him hand over fist. What's the real reason you're not selling his paintings? Because there's got to be a reason behind that. Because you don't want us to find the bodies? Because you guys know that he's a serial killer? Maybe that's why he let the Kowalskis walk all over him. But there is another theory about the Kowalskis. Or maybe like a rumor. Steve, Bob's son, heavily suggested that the two of them were sleeping together, were lovers, but this has been kind of like an ongoing thing that I have found in all of my research, is that maybe Bob and Annette were sleeping together. And maybe this is why he went into business with the Kowalski family and why he just kind of like followed whatever they said, because he was potentially in love with her. But it could go deeper. Maybe both the Kowalskis were in on it. Like, Walt was like, yeah, Annette, go sleep with Bob. We're just going to make a bunch of money off of him. Seems kind of crazy to me, but possible? I don't know. I guess it's like a husband pimping out his wife. I kind of came up with a third theory. So I was explaining this theory a little bit to my husband, and he was like, Bob Ross is such a nice guy. Like, I can't imagine him being a serial killer. And I was like, okay, well, what if there was a serial killer out there and they loved to watch Bob Ross? They were in love with Bob Ross. I don't know. They just really liked him. Or maybe the opposite. Maybe they completely hated him. So they found landscapes that look very similar to the landscapes Bob Ross was painting. And then they buried their victims there, which is why there's 5 bodies found in the landscape that looks very similar to one that he painted. So maybe Ross isn't the actual serial killer, but maybe there's a serial killer out there trying to frame him. There's a couple different options here. I'm not sure exactly what I believe. I think it's very odd that there would be a lot of dead bodies found in a landscape that looks a lot like one that he painted. And actually, there's not just one. There's a couple different landscapes where bodies were found. But in one specific one, there's 5 bodies found, that's pretty significant. But also the fact that the Kowalskis won't release any of his paintings, that's the thing that really gets me. That's the part that I'm hung up on. Because the Kowalskis are in it for a buck. They don't care about anybody's feelings. So the fact that they're not making money off of his paintings or selling his paintings, that's where I don't get it. Because I read that some people will pay up to $10,000 for a Bob Ross original. Probably more than that. Because it's somewhere between like fan fiction, because, you know, like he was a TV personality, and also just like fine art because it's like a nice work of art. So it's this weird mix between people that like actually enjoy art and people that are just fans of Bob Ross. But it doesn't matter because people pay money. I don't know. I put a poll on my Instagram. I'd love to hear what you guys think. If you think he was a serial killer or there's no way that he was a serial killer. It's up to you. I have not decided what I think on this one. I think it's possible. But at this point, you know, anything's possible. So, of course, my friends, as always, until next week, stay skeptical, and I will see you all then. Hey friends, The Rabbit Hole is an independent podcast with everything you hear done by me, Danny Mercy. I appreciate all of your support. Please rate and review wherever you're listening. If you want to follow us on Instagram, it's at rabbit.holepodcast. And thank you, Zakar Balaha, for our awesome intro.